What inspiring intro. What would you do if the people who were supposed to stand beside you on the most important day of your life simply didn't show up? Not because they couldn't, but because they chose something else. Imagine walking into a moment you once dreamed about. A moment filled with hope, love, and everything you thought would finally bring your family together. Only to realize that the seats meant for them are empty. No calls that mattered. No presence when it counted. Just silence, where support should have been. Now here's the real question. What happens after that? Do you break? Do you chase their approval? Or do you rise in a way they never expected? Because this isn't just a story about being overlooked. It's about what comes after the disappointment. It's about the quiet decisions that change everything, the kind of decisions that turn pain into power, and absence into unstoppable growth. And just when you think the story ends there, life has a way of bringing everything full circle. The same people who once walked away sometimes come back, but not always for the reasons you'd hope. Stay with this story till the end. Because what happens next isn't just surprising, it's powerful enough to change the way you see betrayal, success, and your own worth forever. A once-in-a-lifetime moment carries a weight that words can barely hold. A wedding is not just an event marked on a calendar, it is the culmination of years of dreams, quiet hopes, and the belief that when the moment finally arrives, the people who matter most will stand beside you. When that expectation is broken, the pain cuts deeper than ordinary disappointment because it reshapes how love and priority are understood. Being overlooked in such a defining moment is not simply about absence, it is about what that absence represents. It signals that something meant to be sacred was measured and found less important. The decision to attend another celebration instead does not happen in isolation. It reflects a pattern of choices, a hierarchy of importance that has likely existed for years. In that instant, the truth becomes undeniable. Not all bonds are valued equally, and not all love is unconditional. The emotional impact of that realization is complex. There is confusion as the mind tries to justify what the heart already knows. There is hurt, sharp and immediate, as expectations collapse. And there is a quiet shift that begins to take place, where reliance on others starts to fade. It becomes clear that depending on people who fail to show up can lead to repeated disappointment, especially when it matters most. What makes the moment even more significant is its permanence. A wedding cannot be replayed or rescheduled to include those who chose not to attend. The absence becomes a fixed part of the memory, woven into every photograph and every recollection. It transforms what should have been pure joy into something layered with loss, forcing a person to reconcile celebration with silent grief. Over time, that experience shapes perspective. It teaches that presence is the most honest form of love, far more meaningful than words or promises. It reveals that priorities are proven through actions, not intentions. And it forces a reevaluation of relationships, pushing a person to see clearly who truly values them and who does not. Sibling favoritism is rarely a single moment. It is a pattern that quietly unfolds over years, shaping perceptions, relationships, and self-worth in ways that are not always immediately visible. It begins in small, almost unnoticeable ways. One child's achievements celebrated more loudly, their mistakes forgiven more easily, their needs prioritized without question. Over time, these repeated choices form an unspoken hierarchy, where one sibling is consistently placed above the other. For the one on the receiving end of less attention, the impact is deeply internal. It creates a constant sense of comparison, where worth feels conditional and measured against someone else's presence. Even significant milestones can feel diminished, as there is an underlying expectation that they will never hold the same importance. This doesn't just affect confidence, it alters how love itself is understood, making it seem uneven, selective, and dependent on meeting invisible standards. What makes favoritism particularly painful is that it often goes unacknowledged. It hides behind excuses, justifications, or denial, making it difficult to confront directly. When feelings are expressed, they may be dismissed as overreactions or misunderstandings, further reinforcing the imbalance. This lack of validation can be more damaging than the favoritism itself, as it silences the experience and isolates the individual within their own family. In moments that should unite a family, such as major life events, this dynamic becomes impossible to ignore. Choices made during these times reveal true priorities, stripping away any illusions of equality. When one sibling's celebration is chosen over another's once-in-a-lifetime moment, it is not just a decision about schedules, it is a confirmation of a long-standing pattern. It sends a clear message about whose happiness is considered more important. The emotional consequences extend beyond the immediate situation. It can lead to distance, not out of anger alone, but as a form of self-preservation. Trust becomes fragile, and expectations begin to fade, replaced by a guarded understanding of what can realistically be expected. At the same time, it can spark a powerful internal shift, where self-worth is no longer tied to external validation, but begins to be rebuilt independently. Pain does not always announce itself with raised voices or visible conflict. Some of the deepest wounds exist in silence, carried behind composed expressions and controlled words. Silent pain is often misunderstood because it lacks outward intensity, yet it can be far heavier than loud displays of anger or frustration. It is the kind of hurt that is absorbed rather than expressed, processed internally instead of released. When disrespect is loud, it is easy to identify and confront. It creates a clear moment of tension, something that can be pointed to and addressed. But silent pain operates differently. It builds gradually, formed by repeated moments of being overlooked, dismissed, or undervalued. Each instance may seem small on its own, but together they create a weight that becomes impossible to ignore. The absence of acknowledgement only deepens its impact, as there is no outlet for resolution. Choosing silence is not always a sign of weakness, often, it is a form of restraint. It reflects an understanding that not every situation will change through confrontation, especially when patterns are deeply rooted. Instead of reacting immediately, the pain is observed, analyzed, and internalized. This process can lead to clarity, allowing a person to see situations for what they truly are without the distortion of emotional outbursts. However, silence comes at a cost. Without expression, emotions have no release, and they begin to settle within, shaping thoughts and perceptions. It can create distance, not just from others, but from the part of oneself that once expected understanding and fairness. Over time, silence transforms from a temporary response into a protective barrier, preventing further disappointment but also limiting connection. At the same time, silent pain has the power to transform. It sharpens awareness, making it easier to recognize patterns of behavior and underlying intentions. It shifts focus inward, encouraging growth that is independent of external validation. While loud disrespect demands attention in the moment, silent endurance often leads to long-term strength, built quietly and steadily beneath the surface. The contrast between the two highlights a deeper truth. Not all battles are meant to be fought openly. Some are endured, learned from, and ultimately outgrown without ever being spoken aloud. Emotional independence is often born from moments when support is expected, but never arrives. It is not something people usually choose at the beginning. It develops when reliance on others repeatedly leads to disappointment. When those who are supposed to stand closest fail to show up, a quiet realization begins to take shape that stability cannot depend on anyone else's presence, approval, or understanding. At first, this shift can feel isolating. There is a natural desire to be supported, to be seen, and to feel valued by those who are meant to care. When that need is unmet, it forces a person to confront a difficult truth: emotional security must come from within. This realization is not immediate or easy. It often emerges through reflection, through repeated experiences that make it clear that waiting for validation can hold a person back. As emotional independence grows, so does a sense of control. Reactions become more measured, no longer dictated by the actions or opinions of others. Instead of seeking reassurance, there is a stronger reliance on personal judgment and inner clarity. This creates a steadiness that is not easily shaken, even in situations that once would have caused deep emotional distress. It allows decisions to be made based on self-respect rather than the desire to please or be accepted. This kind of independence also changes how relationships are viewed. Connections are no longer formed out of necessity or fear of being alone, but out of genuine choice. There is less tolerance for behavior that undermines self-worth, and more emphasis on mutual respect and consistency. It becomes easier to recognize when someone's presence adds value, and when it does not, leading to healthier boundaries and more balanced interactions. At the same time, emotional independence does not mean becoming distant or unfeeling. It means understanding that while relationships can bring meaning and support, they should not define one's sense of worth. It creates the ability to engage with others without losing oneself, to care without becoming dependent, and to walk away when necessary without feeling incomplete. Over time, this inner strength becomes a foundation that cannot be easily shaken. It replaces uncertainty with confidence and transforms past disappointments into lessons that guide future choices. Turning pain into power is not an automatic reaction, it is a deliberate transformation that takes place over time. When faced with betrayal or neglect, the initial response is often emotional: hurt, anger, confusion. These feelings are natural, but what defines the outcome is what is done with them. Pain can either become something that holds a person back or something that pushes them forward with greater determination. At its core, this transformation begins with a shift in perspective. Instead of viewing painful experiences as purely negative, they are seen as sources of insight. Every moment of being overlooked, every instance of feeling undervalued, carries a lesson about resilience, boundaries, and self-worth. These lessons, once understood, become tools that shape stronger decisions and clearer priorities. Channeling pain into productive action requires discipline. It means choosing growth over resentment, even when resentment feels justified. Rather than seeking validation from those who failed to provide it, energy is redirected inward, toward personal development, goals, and achievements. This process is not about proving others wrong in a loud or confrontational way, it is about building something meaningful that stands on its own. There is also a quiet strength in refusing to let negative experiences define identity. Pain may be part of the story, but it does not have to control the narrative. By focusing on progress, a person begins to reclaim control over their direction, replacing feelings of helplessness with a sense of purpose. Each step forward becomes evidence that circumstances do not determine outcomes. Over time, this approach creates a noticeable shift. What once felt like a setback becomes a source of motivation. The same experiences that could have caused lasting damage instead contribute to growth and resilience. This does not erase the past, but it changes its impact, turning it into something constructive rather than destructive. The result is a form of strength that is deeply rooted and difficult to shake. It is built not from comfort, but from challenge, and it carries a quiet confidence that does not rely on external recognition. Boundaries are often misunderstood as distance or rejection, but in reality they are a form of self-respect. They define what is acceptable and what is not, creating a clear line between tolerance and self-preservation. When someone repeatedly experiences neglect or disrespect, the absence of boundaries allows that behavior to continue unchecked. Over time, this not only reinforces the actions of others, but also weakens one's own sense of worth. Establishing boundaries begins with awareness. It requires recognizing patterns that cause harm, even when they come from familiar or deeply rooted relationships. This can be difficult, especially when emotional ties create a sense of obligation or guilt. There is often a fear that setting limits will lead to conflict or rejection, but the reality is that without those limits, the cycle of disrespect continues without consequence. Boundaries are not about controlling others, they are about controlling access. They determine how much influence someone is allowed to have, how much behavior is tolerated, and how much energy is given. This shift in control is powerful because it changes the dynamic entirely. Instead of waiting for others to change, a person takes responsibility for their own well-being by deciding what they will and will not accept. Enforcing boundaries requires consistency. A boundary stated once but not maintained loses its meaning. It is through repeated action that boundaries gain strength, teaching others that respect is not optional. This process can be uncomfortable, particularly when it challenges long-standing habits or expectations. Some people may resist or react negatively, especially if they are used to having unrestricted access or influence. At the same time, boundaries create clarity. They remove uncertainty from relationships, making it easier to understand where things stand. This clarity can strengthen healthy connections as mutual respect becomes the foundation. For those who are unwilling to respect these limits, boundaries naturally create distance, not as punishment, but as a necessary form of protection. Over time, the presence of strong boundaries reinforces self-worth. It sends a clear internal message that respect is deserved and non-negotiable, shaping not only how others behave, but also how one sees oneself. Success without support is a different kind of journey, one that demands resilience at every step. When encouragement is absent and recognition is limited, progress becomes a deeply personal responsibility. There are no reassurances to rely on, no external validation to confirm that the path is right. Instead, every decision must be made with self-trust, even in moments of uncertainty. In the absence of support, motivation has to come from within. This creates a stronger sense of discipline, as there is no one to fall back on when challenges arise. Setbacks cannot be softened by comforting words, so they must be faced directly and worked through independently. This process builds a level of mental strength that is difficult to develop when support is readily available, as it forces a person to confront difficulties without distraction. There is also a unique clarity that comes from walking this path alone. Without outside influence shaping choices, goals become more authentic and aligned with personal values. Decisions are not made to meet expectations or gain approval, but to create something meaningful. This independence sharpens focus, allowing energy to be directed toward growth rather than seeking validation. At the same time, the journey can feel isolating. Achievements may go unnoticed by those who once had the opportunity to support but chose not to. This lack of acknowledgement can create moments of doubt where the significance of progress feels diminished. However, over time, the meaning of success begins to shift. It is no longer measured by recognition from others, but by the effort, persistence, and consistency that made it possible. The absence of support also highlights the value of self-reliance. It teaches that stability does not depend on external factors but on internal strength. Each milestone reached becomes evidence that progress is possible, even without encouragement. This realization builds confidence that is rooted in experience rather than opinion. As growth continues, success takes on a deeper significance. It becomes more than an outcome, it becomes proof of endurance, a reflection of determination, and a reminder that even without support, it is possible to move forward and create something meaningful. The return of regret rarely comes with honesty at first. It often arrives quietly, disguised as concern, curiosity, or an attempt to reconnect. After a long period of absence or indifference, the sudden shift in behavior can feel confusing. The same people who once overlooked important moments begin to show interest, reaching out as if the distance never existed. But beneath that change is usually a deeper reason, one that is not always openly acknowledged. Regret tends to surface when the consequences of past actions become unavoidable. Time creates perspective, and choices that once seemed insignificant begin to carry weight. Missing important milestones, failing to offer support, or consistently prioritizing one person over another does not disappear, it lingers, shaping how relationships evolve. When those who were once ignored begin to grow, succeed, or move forward without dependence, it forces a realization that something valuable was taken for granted. This realization, however, does not always lead to genuine accountability. Instead, it often leads to attempts at re-entry, where connection is sought not purely out of remorse, but out of need. The timing of this return is significant. It tends to happen when there is something to gain: emotional reassurance, financial help, or access to the stability that was built independently. This creates a contrast between past neglect and present interest, making intentions more visible. For the person on the receiving end, this moment can be complex. There may be a mix of emotions, old feelings resurfacing alongside a clearer understanding of what has already been experienced. The difference now is perspective. What once might have been accepted without question is now examined more carefully. The absence of support in the past becomes a reference point, making it easier to recognize patterns and avoid repeating them. Regret, in this sense, is not just about what others feel, it is about what it reveals. It exposes the true nature of past decisions and highlights the shift in dynamics that has taken place. What was once an unbalanced relationship begins to change, not because of apologies alone, but because the person who was once overlooked has grown beyond needing the validation that was once withheld. Self-worth realization is often not something that develops in comfort. It emerges through moments of neglect, comparison, and emotional distance. When someone repeatedly feels overlooked or undervalued, there comes a point where the need for external validation begins to lose its hold. What once felt like a constant search for approval slowly transforms into a deeper understanding that worth is not something others can grant or deny. At the beginning, this realization is not clear or immediate. There is often a long period of questioning, wondering what could have been done differently, why attention or support was uneven, and whether value is somehow lacking. These thoughts can create self-doubt, as the mind tries to make sense of repeated experiences that do not feel fair. Over time, however, patterns become visible, and it becomes easier to separate personal value from the behavior of others. This shift is significant because it changes the source of validation. Instead of looking outward for recognition, attention turns inward. Achievements, efforts, and personal growth begin to carry their own meaning, independent of whether they are acknowledged by others. This creates a more stable sense of confidence, one that is not easily shaken by external opinions or inconsistent support. Understanding self-worth also changes how boundaries are set and maintained. When value is recognized internally, there is less tolerance for situations that undermine it. Disrespect, neglect, or unequal treatment become easier to identify and less acceptable to endure. This does not come from a place of anger but from clarity, a clear sense of what is deserved and what is not. There is also a sense of freedom that comes with this realization. The pressure to compete for attention or approval begins to fade, replaced by a focus on personal direction and fulfillment. Relationships are no longer defined by the need to be chosen, but by mutual respect and genuine connection. This shift allows for healthier interactions where presence is valued but not required for self-validation. As this understanding deepens, self-worth becomes less about proving anything and more about knowing. It becomes a quiet certainty, built through experience, that remains steady regardless of how others choose to act or respond. Revenge is often imagined as something loud, immediate, and directed outward, but the most powerful form of it takes a completely different shape. It is not built on confrontation or the need to prove others wrong in a visible way. Instead, it develops quietly, through growth, discipline, and a steady commitment to becoming stronger than the circumstances that once caused pain. At first, the desire for revenge can feel intense, driven by a need for fairness or acknowledgement. There is a natural urge to make others understand the impact of their actions, to make them feel the same disappointment or hurt. However, acting on that impulse rarely leads to lasting satisfaction. It keeps attention fixed on the past, tying progress to the behavior of others rather than personal direction. Choosing growth over destruction requires a shift in focus. Energy that could be spent on resentment is redirected toward improvement, goals, and self-development. This does not mean ignoring what happened, but rather using it as motivation to move forward with purpose. Step taken in this direction creates distance from the original pain, replacing reactive emotions with intentional action. This approach to revenge is powerful because it is independent. It does not rely on anyone noticing or acknowledging the change. Progress happens regardless of who is watching, and success is not defined by comparison or validation. Over time, this creates a sense of control that is far more satisfying than any temporary reaction. It allows a person to build something meaningful without being held back by the need to respond. There is also a deeper impact that comes with this kind of transformation. When growth becomes visible, it naturally shifts dynamics. Those who once overlooked or underestimated begin to see the difference, not because it was forced upon them, but because it is undeniable. This change speaks more clearly than any argument or confrontation ever could. In the end, this form of revenge is not about others at all. It is about reclaiming direction, building strength, and creating a life that stands as proof that setbacks can be turned into something far greater. A conclusion. Some moments in life don't break you, they reveal you. They show you who stands who was and is when it's convenient. What once felt like rejection becomes clarity. What once felt like loss becomes direction. Not being chosen on one of the most important days was never the end of the story. It was the beginning of understanding. Understanding that worth is not decided by attention, that love is proven through presence, and that respect is built through boundaries. Every experience, no matter how painful, carried a lesson that shapes strength, independence, and purpose. The journey from being overlooked to becoming self-reliant is not easy, but it is powerful. It transforms silence into confidence, pain into discipline, and absence into motivation. And in the end, the greatest victory is not making others regret their choices. It is reaching a point where their choices no longer define you. Because true success is not about who didn't show up. It's about how far you went without them. Thank you for listening, for reflecting, and for allowing this story to resonate with your own experiences. If you've ever felt overlooked, underestimated, or left behind, remember, your story is still being written, and you hold the pen. May you find the strength to rise above every setback, the courage to set your own standards, and the confidence to walk your path without waiting for approval. Good luck on your journey ahead. May it be filled with growth, clarity, and success that speaks louder than any words ever could.